The first thing I want to talk about today is brushes. So you have a couple different choices for watercolor brushes. However, the general consensus is you want them to be as fluffy as possible, but you also want them to carry as much water as possible also. That's going to give you the smoothest finish, and it's going to make it so you don't need to dip your brush every like 5 seconds. It's going to hold a lot of color, and it's going to make it really easy to make really nice long strokes. So this is a good example of a really fluffy brush. This is going to be your standard brush that you're going to get. It may not be this size exactly, but the round brush is probably the most common, especially among beginners. You really only need 2 or 3 brushes for most things. This is a number 10 for your big wet washes, which I'm going to show in a second here. And then you're going to actually have a smaller round brush. So this one is dirty right now, so it's a little stiff, but this is the same exact brush, except this one's a 10 and this one's a 6. So I typically like to use 10 for my bigger stuff. You'll notice I also have a larger version of this guy. This is 1/4. I would definitely recommend the Princeton Neptune brushes. An example of what not to have for watercolor is these really stiff acrylic brushes. This is a nice brush. This is a black gold brush, so it's really nice, really solid. However, when you're painting with watercolor, you don't want a stiff brush. This is another example of a stiff brush. I love the Da Vinci brush for acrylic. However, this is not what you want for watercolor. These brushes got popular a couple years ago for traveling paintings. So these brushes, these watercolor brushes, actually come with water inside them, so that way you don't have to carry around a cup while you're painting. So these are really nice for travel, or for like if you have little kids or something that are painting, and you just push it and the water comes out that way. These brushes are like really plasticky. All the brushes I showed you today were synthetic, but not all synthetic brushes feel the same. In fact, they all can vary in thickness quite a bit. So these are much stiffer than the fluffy brush like this. Either or works. It's all up to preference and what you like. If you're just starting though, realistically, you don't need to get all the different brushes. I've been painting for years, and I always come back to the Princeton Neptune brushes, and while I have a ridiculous amount of these brushes, I really only use the round brushes and these square ones occasionally. Next up is paper. So for watercolor paper in particular, it's all up to preference too, but I would much more highly suggest cold press paper for most things you're going to be doing with it. So there's hot press and then there's cold press, and they feel very different. All papers from different brands are going to have a slightly different texture to it. This is why I don't really think you should buy art supplies online, but rather get them in person at your local or small art store, because then you can actually go around and feel all the paper for the preference. Cold press watercolor paper is going to be pretty thick, and it's also going to have more texture. I personally prefer that. I like the texture, and it will absorb more too. Whereas hot press is going to be like super smooth, and it's only really going to be able to take 1 or 2 washes of color before it starts to like rip the paper up a little bit. So definitely go the cold press route. When you're talking about watercolor paper, the higher the cotton content is, the more expensive it's going to be. However, there is definitely ways around this. Cotton paper is like the best for watercolor artists and is like held to the highest standard for big pieces, famous artists, or for stuff that's going to go in museums. However, it's not necessary for everyone, especially for beginners. So There are essentially two different types of watercolor types. It gets more niche, but very base level there is opaque and transparent watercolor, and there's semi-transparent as well. Basically, transparent means it lets light through and it allows for a lot of layering, and opaque means it doesn't, the opposite. And a way to test what your paints are is draw this black line here and then put a line over it and see what happens. I know a lot of artists that prefer transparent, especially portrait artists. They prefer transparent paint over opaque paint because they can layer up the skin a lot and not have really crunchy opaque lines, I guess. Alright, so these are all different brands of paint. These first two over here are a really cheap brand whose name I don't even remember. I didn't even buy them, I just own them for some reason. And you'll notice they are very transparent. You can see the black line completely through it, and it even smears with the black, which is kind of a sign that they're not the best quality. The next here we have is stone ground paint. This is semi-opaque, it seems. This blue is much more opaque than this red, which is a little blotchy. That's an opaque paint. And then these are Winsor and Newton. And these are also opaque. This is also the stone ground paint. I was trying to do another swatch of the red. I do really like this red, but as you can see, it does weird stuff sometimes. I did a monochromatic red painting once with red, and it went pretty bad because they're just crunchy. The lines are crunchy. So, stone ground paint has a really high price point. So if you're going into nicer paintings, I would suggest that Winsor and Newton is pretty solid. That's these two. They're a medium price point. I wouldn't purchase it for children under the age of 10. However, for watercolor artists, it's a pretty solid middle ground. I really love Winsor and Newton. And then lastly, this is some cheap brand. There you go. I would always suggest the middle point, I guess, with watercolor brands. Typically, watercolor comes in 2 or 3 different forms. They come in these pallets, in a tube, or occasionally you'll see them in glass ink bottles that are super condensed that you add water to. Most common, it'll be these two. And if you're a beginner, it's going to be one of these options, realistically. The difference between tube and palette watercolor is that the tube colors are significantly brighter and usually more opaque as well. Quality is about the same overall, but it's really all up to preference. I personally prefer palettes because you do get more bang for your buck this way. You end up wasting a lot of color when it's actually inside a tube. That being, because when you put it on the palette and you don't use all the color, it's wasted. However, when you're mixing in one of these guys, you're just not wasting as much. Because if you don't use it, it's still in the palette and you can come back to it later. Alrighty, what palette do you want to use when you're working with watercolor? Regardless of if it's tube, in tin, or if it's in a glass container, it's all about the same. So the first I want to start off with is your cheapest option. Can't really see it, but this is a children's lunch plate. It's split up into 3 sections. It's really hard to clean. And because it's so large, a lot of the water is going to mix with each other and you're not going to be able to get an accurate hue because you won't be able to pool. Pooling is kind of necessary if you want to get an accurate color, if you're color matching, which you probably will be doing with your watercolor. And so when you have these big open spaces, that makes it really difficult to do. The next best option is actually inside here. This is tin. I think it's tin. It's something. But it has all these little individual slots you can use, so you can put your watercolor in here. And you can really get a lot of water in there, so you can get like a really accurate color, and so it can also be consistent throughout the painting. So if you're making a single skin tone, it's going to be that same consistent skin tone throughout the piece, which is important. And you're also going to be able to see the color better when you have this option. You'll notice this is really well loved. I very rarely just get the paint out of the tin and put it on there. I usually mix it on here first. So a palette is necessary if you want to like put effort and time into your color choices. I would suggest this. This is about your mid-range price point. The most expensive and fanciest, which is not necessary for beginners, is this porcelain palette. Porcelain's really nice because it doesn't stain, has a lot of weight to it, and you'll notice it has all these little sections. The water's not gonna like spill out of here, which is perfect for pooling. That's the most important part when you're picking out palettes. You want something that's not gonna stain, something that's gonna pool, and it's gonna work really well. Alrighty, this is my watercolor painting setup. I have my paints here, I have a palette here, I have a palette over here too, and I have 2 cups of water. This is important because you don't have to go and run to the bathroom or kitchen or whatever every time you need new water. It just makes the process faster. This is my dirty water and this is my cleaner water. I mean, they're both kind of muddy and need to be refilled. Then I have my paper here, and then I keep my brushes and my paper towel here. This is works best for me. I am right-handed. This might be backwards if you're left, and there's little whatever. It changes a little bit depending on the way you paint and just personal preference. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? But this is vaguely what a setup looks like. Technique. Alrighty, so this is what everybody came here for. So I'm going to talk about the techniques. When you first start a painting, I typically start with wet on wet. My personal technique for a whole painting is to start off really messy and then slowly make it more and more organized. So for the wet on wet technique, you'll notice I just wet down the paper. You want it to be pretty wet. I'm gonna put it at some different angles so you can kind of see it. I don't know, but the paper is wet, and so when you go in with your wet paint, you want to pool your color like previously mentioned. I'll give an example. So you put the color here, put the color on top, and when you mix it around, it makes it so all of the water has the same consistent color. And so you want to get it really diluted for the wet on wet technique. The wetter you make your paint, or the more water you add to your paint in this scenario, is going to vastly change how it works. Next I want to talk about is wet on dry. So this paper right here, it's dry, and so you pour your watercolor, and then you do whatever with it. So I typically start the painting with this, for portraits at least, and kind of end it with this. I'm like slowly refining it. So for a dry on wet, this is kind of like a textural thing. You're not going to use this as often unless you want a like kind of specific look. In this scenario, the paints that you put on there is going to be not going to be a lot of water added to it. And it gives this look to it. So these are both on wet techniques. or called a wash, kind of. But this is just how much water is like in the paint when you put it on there. Makes a pretty big difference. Next I'm going to do the ombre. The ombre is also the wet on wet technique. It's just a little more specific. I'm going to get the paper really wet. When you're learning about watercolor, this isn't often mentioned, but you can actually pick up your watercolor after you've set it down. I typically do this right after I wet it, and I grab a piece of dry paper towel, and you can pick it up this way. I've also seen people do this with the magic eraser, but you can also take a clean brush, a clean dry brush preferably. You can pick up some of the paint like this. You wipe it off, clean the brush, and then you wipe it off, clean the brush. So you can pick up old paint this way. The important part about this is that you're cleaning the brush after every swipe. I saved the most interesting technique for last because it's the most fun, I guess. For this technique, you're going to want to put a really heavy layer of watercolor down. You want it to be really thick and vibrant. That's how you're going to get the best results with this. Really wet, really thick, really vibrant. Next thing you're going to need is salt. It's important for this that you use coarse salt and not fine salt, because the larger the granules are, the better it's going to turn out for you. Basically, you take the salt and then you put the salt on the painting. And so, as you may know, salt picks up and absorbs water, and with it will also absorb the color, and so it gives a cool effect. It also adds a lot of texture to your piece. The more layers you do with this on top of it, the thicker it's going to be, and it's really nice because actually if you touch the paper after the salt is gone, it leaves behind like these little like burrows and stuff. Alrighty, for this last section today, we're going to be creating a finished and final piece using the techniques we learned today. Oh my. First technique we learned today, the wet wash, or the wet on wet, is actually the first step in painting usually, so that's what I started with today. So this is where I lay all my base colors, get an idea of where everything's going, and this also creates a little bit of a nice ombre effect, which we also learned about. So what you see right now is the paper bowing a lot. It's actually curling in on itself. It does this to varying levels depending on what type of paper you use. Typically with cotton, it doesn't bow as much. If you want to avoid this effect, you can really easily do it just by taping your painting to your desk or whatever, and you won't do this. However, it's not a super big deal if it does bow, because after everything's dried, you could just place some books on top of it and suddenly it's flat again. Right here I use the cleanup technique to fix some of those lines that I did during the wet wash. This is really nice. It brings a lot more form to the piece. And here I lay down the coarse salt. I'm very particular about where each of the pieces goes, but it's totally worth it later. And then I kind of just wait for it to dry while the salt does its thing. I'm doing some other stuff around, you can see. After the painting has dried and the salt has been removed, I start to do my wet on dry. This is where I refine the painting, add a lot of color, make it really come to life. I love these really bright oranges I used. These are opaque watercolors, by the way. Alrighty, thank you for watching. Feel free to DM me or just comment if you have any more questions, and I will try to respond in a timely manner. Thank you.